I am very happy today to host a panel at our university to talk about strengthening science and governance. To this interesting discussion, we have invited three speakers involving different initiatives and on different sustainable development goals. 14, life below water, and 15, life on land. So I'll do a brief presentation of our speakers, stressing some particular aspects of their trajectories related to our panel. So we have as a first speaker today, Mr. Leimgruber. He is the head of Conservation Ecology Center at Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute in the US. And this institute seeks to save species and ecosystems through basic and applied research. So Leimgruber's research focuses on advancing conservation applications of geospatial analysis technology to save threatened and endangered species. And he has over 30 years of experience working in international conservation. And most of his research has been focused on how human-driven environmental change affect the movement, the distribution, and the survival of threatened and endangered species. And as a second speaker, we have Rafael Magris, who is an environmental analyst at the Chico Mendes Institute for Biodiversity Conservation at the Ministry of Environment. And Rafael is our speaker representing the SDG 14, life below water, once he's a marine ecologist. And he has been involved in coral reef conservation initiatives and conservation planning and the conservation effectiveness of marine protected areas. And his main interest is to apply conservation science to governance and decision making. And he may not know, but he undergraduated in the same university as I did, the Federal University of Espírito Santo. And maybe he is a capixaba like me. And Professor Joly is a recently retired professor of plant ecology from the University of Campinas, our third speaker. He's a member of the task force in capacity building of ICMBio and of the Scientific Advisory Committee of the Inter-American Institute for Global Change Research. He's now chair of the program Biodiversity and the Brazilian Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Service. He has won many awards and also has been advisor of many plant ecologists in Brazil. His main interest, as I can read from his story for more than 30 years, is to get involved as a scientist in many decision-making instances and to produce science synthesis to support better governance on biodiversity. So I'm very happy to have you all here, and I'd like then to begin with our first panelist, Peter, please.
Thanks. Let me just share my screen here. Okay. Can you see? Is it working?
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. As Isabella has said already, my name is Peter Leimgruber. I'm at the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute, where I work as a conservation and landscape ecologist, and I lead the Conservation Ecology Center. I'd like to thank Isabella and the organizers for inviting me to this symposium, and look forward to interacting with the panel members as well as the audience. So my talk is focused on the UN Sustainable Development Goal 15, life on land, or more specifically, how we can conserve, restore, and sustainably use terrestrial ecosystems. As you can see on the left here, SDG 15 has many sub-goals, and they can roughly be summarized as conservation, restoration, and sustainable use, with some specific focus on reducing, halting, and reversing habitat loss and the associated biodiversity loss, halting poaching and illegal wildlife trade, reducing and mitigating the spread of a negative impact of invasive species, better integrating conservation into planning and development, and mobilizing more funding for conservation. Although the UN provides an encouraging update on their website to the SD, I believe that we're probably trailing behind of what can and what must be accomplished to live sustainably. Take the world's forest, for example. This is a forest report from FAO. And although the relative rate of global deforestation has slowed, we're still losing critically important forests, in fact, nearly 5 million hectares each year. And this is only net change, meaning the actual change of primary intact forests is much higher. These forests can't simply be replaced by new forest growth because old forests store much more carbon and provide much more biodiversity. Similarly, we're continuing to lose species at rapid rates. This slide is from the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which I believe many of you will know. This is a report from 2019. And when you look at the left panel, then we're losing species at rates 100 to 1,000 times faster or above the background extinction rate. And if you look at the panel on the right, then you can see that we're continuing to lose species. In fact, 57% or 7,400 species roughly of all known vertebrate species are threatened by extinctions. So by most measures, we can probably say that we're currently not achieving the goal of SD15. So what is the role of conservation scientists, or what can we do? And I do think we need to step back and think about what we're most interested in, which is really understanding how terrestrial ecosystems work. Human populations and their well-being have demands which usually are expressed in land use, and the land use changes, and those affect the functioning of biodiversity, the functioning of ecosystems, and in turn then affect what ecosystem services are available to sustain our economies or support well-being. When this system is out of balance, and it is, then increased demand on land use just basically ruin the biological functions of the systems. As ecologists, we need to understand, we need to be able to actually measure this and quantify it. We need to understand what the routes are, how this functions, and then we can provide ideas and solutions on how to adjust for this. But that's not an easy task. This is what we at the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute intend to do. Our mission is to save species and ecosystems through science, conservation, and through training of the next generations. I just provide this picture to give you an idea where we're from. I mean, this is our institute. It's 3,500 acres, about 100 kilometers outside Washington, D.C. And on site, we breed endangered species, such as the red panda or the white-naped crane. We conduct a lot of research there in labs and outside in ecological experimental sites. And we have a training facility. We have a campus where we train undergraduate, graduate students, as well as conservation practitioners. We also work globally. My own department alone works with partners, and we do all of this through partners in 38 countries on the various species. Today, I want to talk a bit about work we have done in Myanmar over here in Asia, just because it's really the longest ongoing project I've been involved in, where we really see the outcomes. And then a little bit on work that we have initiated, or we collaborate with people at the Federal University of Paraná on forest mapping. My department has a few focal areas that can be roughly summarized with this slide. So we're working on reintroductions and restorations, which is a big theme for SD15. We're actively involved in reestablishing locally extinct species and their habitat. We also have a large group that does ecological surveys. That's our e-mammal group. They use advanced technologies such as camera trapping, audio recording, as well as analytical techniques to survey where mammals and other species, vertebrate species, still occur. We have a group that works primarily on landscape mapping and remote sensing to assess how these changes cascade through the system and then affect species and species distributions. We have an exciting initiative on movement of life. This is really an attempt to collaborate with others to track mobile species, and especially migratory populations, which provide critical services. In addition, most of our work is on working land and seascapes. So when we do these different projects, we tend to look at a broader scale and also really engage people, because ultimately we're talking about socio-ecological systems that can only function when people and nature interact. And last not least, we are part of a forest ecosystem and climate monitoring network. Together with Forest Geo, we monitor sites across 65 countries in the world where we're looking at the climate change effects on forests. But we're also really interested in how can forests be used to mitigate and reduce some of these effects. I can't go into details with all of these. I just want to highlight a few and then go a bit deeper for a few of these examples. One of the things that I find really interesting, and you can easily look up on the internet, is our camera trapping approach. Camera trapping is really become a standard tool for monitoring wild mammal populations. And it's so compelling because it provides for standardized long-term monitoring that is very simple. So it can really be accomplished by people that have received minimal training, and they don't even have to be experts. The data it generates can then be examined by people that have the taxonomic expertise. So it's really ideal for citizen science and lends itself for much broader scale monitoring than most other things we do. The biggest challenge with camera trapping is that it creates these vast volumes of data that need to be managed, analyzed, and really used. And to better address this, we're collaborating with a large number of groups on a project called Wildlife Insights, which essentially is a website where users can upload their data. They can use the website to manage the data, which then is stored in perpetuity and is safeguarded. And then it's trying to use modern artificial intelligence to automatically identify the different species on these photos, which should dramatically reduce the time needed to really analyze this data. It provides basic analytics. So when you use it, you can calculate biodiversity values. It will have a decision support tool, and it's open to the public, so people can actually get fascinated by the images. If you're wondering what this is, on this image, it's a binturong. So it's basically a civet species photographed in the forests of Borneo. The next small example I want to provide is this movement of life. This is an initiative in collaboration with Max Planck in Germany and many others, where we're trying to advance research on the discovery and the tracking of mobile species. These species are especially vulnerable because the increase of shipping routes and roads and railroads are putting them increasingly at risk. And we're trying to make the technology and tools more accessible through this network and collaborate and really try to address much bigger questions. Again, this is something that with a website allows us to engage with the public that's really fascinated by it. An example from Movement of Life would be this Twiga tracker, which is very popular in Africa. Twiga is the Swahili word for giraffe. And this is a project where with many partners, we're tracking over 200 giraffes. We're tracking their movements across many countries in Africa. And this is already allowing us to really determine how different subspecies of giraffe in different areas are differently affected by anthropogenic change. Now, in sub-Saharan Africa, there's a lot more people, and these animals are much more restricted in their movement as compared to Namibia, where there aren't that many people. Sorry?
I'm sorry.
Okay. The next example is really on how we're using satellite data, and I'll go into greater detail here, how we can use satellite data for monitoring these biodiversity targets or sustainable development goals. Coarse resolution satellite data, you may have heard of MODIS or Landsat or now Sentinel from Europe, really lends itself to continuous and repeated and near real-time monitoring of land cover. This can provide critical baseline data and near real-time monitoring of what's really happening on the ground with, for example, deforestation, forest fires, or other activities. This can be augmented at the local scale with now pretty widely available high-resolution satellite imagery such as WorldView or unmanned aerial vehicles. Until really the beginning of this decade, this kind of data analysis was really restricted to a small group of people that had the computational resources and the access to this imagery. But now almost anyone can do it. And that's largely due to the fact that many of these data are now freely available. And there are open source tools that we're co-developing with others, such as QGIS or Google Earth Engine, that really allow minimally trained people to produce maps of what's going on in areas of their interest. And I think this will rapidly increase and really strengthen civil society organizations as they're trying to figure out what goes on and keep our governments and agencies honest, as well as the conservation NGOs. We use this widely in Myanmar. I'm using Myanmar as an example. I find it fascinating. We have worked there for over 30 years, and we have done a lot of projects, over 60 projects at this point. It's really interesting because it's a biodiversity hotspot. It's situated at the intersection of three major biogeographic regions, the Indian, the Indo-Chinese, as well as the Sundaic region. And it also stretches from alpine meadows in the Himalayas all the way to tropical forests and subtropical forests in the south, as well as mangroves in the Bay of Bengal. So this produces an unparalleled amount of endemism and biodiversity in such a small place. Myanmar is smaller than Minas Gerais, just as a reference for Brazil, but it is really a very critical biodiversity hotspot. In addition to its biodiversity, it was fairly untouched because of unfortunate political events and political isolation. So much of the forests were still present in the 1980s and 1990s when the rest of Southeast Asia was already virtually deforested. So we started working there in the 90s. This is just a picture of some of these forest areas. And we did a lot of ground surveys. We discovered quite a number, co-discovered with our Burmese colleagues, quite a number of new species. But we also started using Landsat, 2 dates of Landsat, to assess how fast is this resource actually declining. And the news was mixed. At the time, 65% of Myanmar was still on the forest cover, which is much more than any other country in mainland Southeast Asia. But deforestation rates were as high as 0.3% annually, which is well above the global average. And if you look locally, if you look at these areas, these are individual Landsat tiles, and the ones that are dark are areas where you find deforestation hotspots. And similar to many countries in the tropics, the forests that are being hit hardest are not necessarily the tropical forests, but they are the mangroves and the dry deciduous forests. Those are the first ones to go usually, and then it stretches into lowland evergreen forest, which happens here in Tanintai. We did this largely on our own, but then the second time around, we engaged civil society in Myanmar. We worked with local NGOs. We trained them to do the mapping, which they did all on their own. We just helped them with the analysis. This is published in 2015, so it's basically the following decades. And it was really interesting because there still is a lot of forest. We were able to also separate what we call intact forests and map the largest remaining patches that you can see here. So intact forest in our concept is something you can measure with remote sensing, but that's ecologically meaningful. We're talking about tall forests that have more than 90 or 95% closed canopy. So these are likely to still maintain most of their ecosystem functions. The analytical results, though, were sobering because deforestation continued to increase. So we're now at 0.55% annually in that decade. And most of this, as you can see below here, deforestation rate in intact forest is actually much higher. And I think this is something we see globally. I mean, the forests that we're losing are not successional forests. They are the most valuable forests. And although we're gaining new forests through replantations, those replantations can't provide the same support for biodiversity. Now, once you have a map like this, you can do all kinds of things. So we used the map as a base layer, and then we convened all the NGOs and encouraged them using our eMammal and Wildlife Insights tools to really bring together all of their camera trapping data. There were 5 different NGOs camera trapping mammals in this region alone of Myanmar, and they all were working on their own, and they weren't combining their data. And we got them to come together, and we were actually able to then use this in occupancy modeling to produce accurate range maps for 38 of the remaining large mammals that are important conservation targets. So this was a long-term effort in Myanmar, and it took 20 years to just get to this point. I think we provide a lot of data that has informed biodiversity conservation in Myanmar and has helped at least attempts to follow this sustainable development goal. But I don't think that we have actually moved decision makers enough to really achieve that. But I think the most important outcome is difficult to measure in these. In the last 10 years alone, I believe we have trained about 300 conservation professionals, from undergraduate to graduate students to forest department members, in new techniques and in science, and really have helped them to gain a better understanding for how to monitor their resources. And I think in the longer run, that will have a much greater impact on monitoring and implementing sustainable development than any data that we produce. Now, I'd like to switch gears, and I've not worked as long in Brazil or collaborated with colleagues in Brazil, but I'd like to talk a little bit about work that I've done in collaboration with Professor Carlucci at the Federal University of Paraná and his students and some other faculty members. And this focuses on developing new tools for mapping the status of Paraná pine. And the results I'm presenting here, now this was all focused on graduate student research, so the result I'm presenting here are really based on the theses of two graduate students at the university, Bruna Sorg and Felipe Saad. Felipe actually has just gone on to do a PhD at the University of Maryland in the remote sensing department. Historically, as you probably all know, araucaria were fairly common throughout the Atlantic forest. They represent a highly unique component of the Atlantic forest. The Paraná pine itself should be considered a keystone plant resource because its presence increases the complexity of forest structure and of food webs, thereby increasing biodiversity. In addition, there are many ancient plant lineages as well as extant plant and animal species that really highly depend on that forest species. So it's a really critical component, but it's also severely threatened because of its valuable wood and because of continued and decades-long unsustainable use of the tree. Unfortunately, the data on the status is fairly limited. There are some assessments that are highly useful that were conducted in the early 2000s using Landsat data, and that already showed a really dramatic decline. But to our knowledge, no one had attempted to directly map this species and the associated forest communities, developing unique signatures from satellite imagery and map them directly. So we set out to address these questions. Can we find Araucaria angustifolia using remote sensing alone? How much of that species and that forest type is left? How much of that is protected? Where are the largest patches, and how can we actually count and map individual trees? Because ultimately we'd be really interested in understanding the population and how the population is developing. And the tools we used for these two studies that I'll be talking about are, at a broad scale, we relied on the new European Sentinel-2 satellite, which provides a higher resolution than Landsat, and some machine learning, specifically random forest modeling in Google Earth Engine. And at the finer scale, we looked at where we try to map individual trees. We try to utilize high resolution worldview 2 imagery, which is about 2 meters spatial resolution, as well as drone based LiDAR laser sensing. And these data were integrated in open source environments that I mentioned before. This map here, which I find highly interesting, is the result of Bruna's thesis. She just defended, by the way, successfully. And what you see here, the gray, is the consensus map of all previously published range maps for Araucaria angustifolia. So this is where most of the science community would agree the species originally occurred. And the black areas that you see, those dots, that's what we could identify from Sentinel-2. This is superimposed on different types of protected areas to give you an assessment of how much is protected. What you should get from this map is that there's very little Araucaria left. Whatever is left is highly fragmented and really reduced to small patches, and relatively little of it is protected. And the numbers bear this out. If you look at the top left here, we're talking about only 4.34% on our maps of our Araucaria left throughout its range. So that's about 1.2 million hectares. And when we divide these remaining patches into size categories that you can see here, from small to very big, then you can see that more than 90% are in patches that are less than 50 hectare. And there's very few that are much larger. We mapped the very large ones. We're pretty sure about those. Those are easy to identify with remote sensing. There will be more error with the smaller patches that will require more work to really figure out how accurate that is. But I think the overall impression that this map gives is a realistic representation of the current situation. So there's very little left. And what's left is protected, but only about 4% in strictly protected areas, IUCN category 1 through 3. Most is very small. Now, this data is most useful is it freely available. So we are putting it out on the internet. People can download it, can use it. And we intend in the future we hope we get feedback, because the best way to improve a map like this is by getting information back where you're wrong or where you're right. So now I'm moving on to Felipe's research, which just 2 days ago came out in Land. And this was really a pilot project trying to figure out how we can use higher resolution satellite imagery and laser sensing to map this species. And this is a WorldView 2 image that you can see here. You see the very distinct dark tree counts of Araucaria angustifolia. So it's relatively easy to visually separate. And we then kind of proceeded to use different kind of processing techniques to refine this imagery before we actually analyzed it. We developed a lot of training sites, and we studied this across 3 study sites close to Curitiba. And this worked really well. So I think we can say that classification accuracy with WorldView 2 imagery, if we could do that across the entire range, would probably be much, much higher than what we have with Sentinel-2. That's not unsurprising. I think eventually there is an issue in where do we identify just trees and where do we identify a forest type. Similarly, LiDAR, which just to kind of repeat a little bit, this data was provided by the Forest Science at Federal University of Paraná. They had surveyed one of these stands with a drone and kindly provided the data for the analysis as well as ground control data. LiDAR itself is basically a laser beam that gets sent down from an airplane, and you measure the return. And based on the return, you can see where the ground level is, you can measure the canopy height, and you get an impression of the density of vegetation that's in there. So essentially, you're getting a 3D map of the vegetation. And this can be used in an object-oriented classification where you train a computer to try to identify individual tree grounds. This is what we did here. These points here are actual Araucaria trees that were identified in ground surveys. The white area is what we classified with the WorldView 2 imagery as Araucaria forest. So you see the crowns here. Then these are the ground polygons that came from the object-oriented classification, with the red one representing Araucaria, and the green is other trees. And then this is the overlap between the WorldView and the LiDAR data. So overall, LiDAR was super effective. We identified 351 trees. We missed 12 trees from the ground survey. We over-predicted 16 trees. So overall, this was about 87% accurate, but would be very good. The disadvantage with LiDAR is really that it's so difficult to acquire over larger areas, but that would be an ideal tool to find Araucaria. So the future directions for this is to just improve on the maps. I've already mentioned that we would love to get feedback from experts, integrating other sensor data, increasing spatial resolution, but also I think artificial intelligence, using neural networks on big mainframe computer type environments would be really essential for mapping this. So what do we get in terms of sustainability? I think it's all about creating the right database, and then you can actually monitor whether you're losing Araucaria or you're regaining Araucaria, can you restore it or not? That's the main thing. But before I end, I really want to come back to what I said about Myanmar. I think that, you know, I've been doing this for over 30 years, and we're involved in other projects where we're trying to work with local communities on managing forests. But I think the most important piece really that we have been providing is training. Really training future generations of people that will then work in these agencies and at universities using this data and really understanding more about biodiversity, ecosystem function, and potential sustainability. We've been doing this. And, you know, my own program, I have data from 2001 to 2018. We have trained more than 273 interns. And these are usually they have graduated with a bachelor's degree, and they come to us for a couple of months before they go on to graduate school or to find a job. You know, our program is fairly international. 31% come from international countries, and 75% of our interns go on to graduate school. And we have a little bit of data on what happens with them afterwards. You know, some of them, very few, go all the way the academic route to become professors, but many really work in NGOs or government or other places to really analyze the data and understand it. And really, I think those are the people that are much closer to the decision making and that can help move the decision making forward. And with that, I come back to the Sustainable Development Goal. So I can take some questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter, for the really nice talk. Many examples of how to work on this. Producing science and strengthening the capacity building in many countries. Let's see. My idea is to have some questions, 10-minute questions for each speaker, but we don't have any right now here. You can, the people who is in the room, you can write through the Zoom chat some questions. Or we can finish our three talks and have many answers. Pose the question at the end also. Let's see, has someone. Okay. So I really like your main message that we need information, we need the database, and we need to train people. So as a professor, I'm really, I think it's a nice message in our university. And do you have a particular example of some of the initiatives you have worked on that you may share as a particular interesting for bridge the gap between science and decision making? I don't know.
It's a really good question, right? I struggle with that a little bit because I've often I feel that the challenge for scientists is to address a question that's relevant to policymakers. But often these groups don't communicate and we don't know what the policymakers want. And the policymakers often complain that the data we produce isn't relevant for their topic. We have a project in Kenya where we work with local communities on fencing projects. And that's probably the most direct relationship we've had. We had a workshop before we started the research, and county officials and local officials wanted to know how bad the fencing was for wildlife. And we actually were able to show them that fencing per se wasn't necessarily the issue, that the stocking rates of the cattle were actually more detrimental than the fencing. And they were really interested in that. And I don't think it has resulted in any changes in the stocking rates, but this is only a year old, this project. So the results out. So we have discussions with them on where to take down some fences to improve the connectivity across the landscape. I would take that as an example because I think that's one of the places where before we started doing our science, we asked the local stakeholders what they wanted to know. And I think that is a really critical key.
Thank you. Yes, I think this to have the problem addressed, to question people what are the problems they have, and then to try to design our research questions around this. It's also helps. It seems a good way to work on that. Okay. Let's see if I have questions in the other panel here. Okay, no. Okay, Peter, I think we can move on.
Yes,
and
thank you.
We wait for more questions at the end. And please, Rafael, I would like you to begin your talk as second speaker.
Hello, everyone. So I'm gonna share my screen. Hold on a little bit. If Isabella can let me know if it all works fine.
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay.
Your presentation worked.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm glad to be here today, talking with these two amazing researchers, Joly and Peter, who just talked before me. I'm gonna go to talk a little bit more about global conservation goals for the ocean, and particularly for the work I have been involved in Brazil. So as we might be aware, I'm talking about the Sustainable Development Goal 14, which is life below water, which basically talks about conserve and sustainably use the ocean, sea, and marine resources for sustainable development. So like this SDG goal, we have several other international agreements, like the CBD Aichi targets, which actually has been reviewed, all related to biodiversity conservation, particularly for the ocean. So I'm not going to address particularly this SDG 14 goal, but also other interrelated international goals like the CBD ones. So as I'm not sure if everyone here is familiar, but marine biodiversity in Brazil, it's outstanding for several reasons. We have one of the largest mangrove forest area close to the Amazon coast. We also have like several different marine ecosystems along these 3,000 kilometers of coastline from equatorial, tropical, and subtropical areas. We have like the only true coral reef ecosystems in the Southern Atlantic Ocean, and one of the largest rhodolite beds, which are like algae coralline crustose beds, and which are particularly an interesting feature because of the role they play for stabilizing and CO2 emissions. So all this biodiversity, of course, then needs protection, and all are related to these international agreements. So for the conservation of all these ecosystems and associated habitats, we have seen an increase in the protection throughout the oceans, and particularly in Brazil. As you can see here, we have like about 20, maybe, I think the global average now it's about over 10% of the ocean protected. In Brazil, this figure, it's a bit higher, where we have like nearly 26% of the oceans protected. You can see here from this figure on the left, all the protection we might got right now. So I'm gonna show you that we have like 3 main categories of marine protected areas. The ones in white, which are like offering partial protection, are the multiple use MEPAs. They combine different extractive uses of biodiversity with protection. So, and these are regulated through their management plans. The second one is the yellow one, which is kind of hard to see because they're really small, but mostly related to mangrove protection on the northern coast. Those are the extractive reserves, which is basically dedicated to protect biodiversity and also coastal communities associated with traditional fisheries. And the third one, and usually the most important for biodiversity protection, are the no-take MEPAs, showing this map by the red polygons. And those are quite small along the coast with a few exceptions, and much larger towards the offshore environment where you see just quite big polygons, which are easily to visualize. So if you have a look at the increase of protection over years, you see by the blue line, which is the coverage area, we see like a steady increase in the MEPAs over time, with this followed by this explosive growth in 2018, where we create this two sets of MEPAs, as we can see here, these big circles on the top and kind of right in the middle of this figure. So all these MEPAs were created at the same time in 2018. So increasing then the percentage of coverage, MEPA coverage from 1.5 up to 26% at the same time. But however, if you see the increase in the number of MEPAs, which are shown by the red line, we see a much more kind of steadily increase without any big step. We can even identify any big step of creation of MEPAs over a short time. So then showing very easily that all this impressive area under protection are actually of course related to this creation of these large scale MEPAs in 2018. So for example, I bet it's hard to see here, but if you analyze the MEPA coverage by habitats, this shows exactly what I was saying before. So we have this big parts of the ocean protected towards deep environments in ecoregions associated with these oceanic islands, which are for the pinky colors in the bottom panel showing this map. And we then have this large MEPA coverage for these coastal habitats, mostly mangrove, beaches and dunes from the northern parts of the ocean, for the northern ecoregions in Brazil, which are the Amazon, northeastern and eastern. And then we have a very much poor development of MEPAs towards the south, particularly for the ecoregions, the southern and the Rio Grande ecoregions, which are the extremely south, covering the extremely south parts of Brazil. So rather than just evaluating the MEPA coverage of MEPAs by different habitat types, I'm going to present here a little bit more information about the effectiveness of these MEPAs. For that, I'm going to explore two case studies. One, it's assessing these large offshore MEPAs, which are remotely managed, right? And very far, over 1,000 kilometers distant offshore. And the second case, I'm going to explore a little bit more the conservation effectiveness of MEPAs closer to the coast, locally managed, and much smaller, of course, as you can easily compare the polygons. So for the first case study, I have used satellite detections of the vessel monitoring system transmission, basically just track fisheries throughout the Brazilian exclusive economic zone. So when you assess those information and you separate those which are clearly associated with fishing operation, we can then analyze the fishing pressure over these areas. For those MEPAs I'm going to present here, most of this fishing are related to pelagic longliners. So basically then we track these fishing vessels over 5 years to explore what's happening before and after those MEPAs were declared. So the top panels on the top panels, they are showing the density of fishing pressure 3 years before the MEPAs were established, and the bottom panels after their declaration. So as you can see, we see a lot of change in the spatial patterns of the fishing, moving from the top maybe towards more the eastern parts of the MEPAs, particularly in 2019. As you can see, we still identify illegal fishing even within the no-take zones. If you remember, this big circle, it's a partial protection MEPA, and it surrounds this polygon, like a trapezoidal polygon, which is the no-take zone where fishing would be not allowed. So if you check the case for the southern MEPA, the one I talk about in the southern part, you can see actually inverse pattern where actually more fishing is occurring within the sustainable use MEPA, and more positively, you can see at least for the 2018 year, fishing has been avoided within the no-take zone. So we see like, again, a displacement of the activity after the MEPAs has been declared. And again, we notice still a little bit of illegal fishing happening within the no-take MEPA. So in this slide, we can see here that actually, if you summarize this information, for the northern MEPAs, which is São Pedro and São Paulo, and the acronym here is SPSP, we see like a decrease in the fishing area within the MEPAs, but we see actually a little bit of an increase in the fishing density because fishing has been concentrated over smaller areas. On the other side, if you check for the southern MEPA, which the acronym here is TMV, which stands for Trindade and Martin Vaz Islands, we see here actually a completely different scenario where fishing area and fishing density has actually increased, but the density is actually reducing because fishing is spreading over larger areas. So now let's see what's happening with the effectiveness of marine protected areas for the ones closer to the coast. For that, we performed a meta-analysis comparing biological measures like species diversity, species abundance for several studies, measuring these indicators within and outside MEPAs. For 18 MEPAs, as you can see in this map on the right, they're well distributed over the coastline of Brazil, again, from the north to the south. So this is a paper where we just publish with those results. For those who are more interested in knowing with more details how this meta-analysis was performed. So the main finding from this study is that we actually could see that full protection MEPAs, which are the no-take ones, increase biodiversity by 45% if compared to areas left open for extractive uses such as fishing and transportation and marine transportation and any other users. If you compare the no-take zones with sustainable use MEPAs, you see a reduction in this biodiversity benefit, where biodiversity has increased up to 22%. This is the average result. And then if you compare the partial protection against open access areas, the result is a way less, which increase of only 0.6%. So we explore as well which ecological effects, which predictors could be more associated with the positive results. And we find different kind of the results are a little bit variable, particularly for the sustainable use MEPAs, the ones which offer partial protection. But basically we test 6 moderators or predictors. Those are the time of protection, which is associated with age of MEPAs, the distance between the MEPA and the control area, which is unprotected, the area, of course, which is very cited as a potential predictor of effectiveness, the management effectiveness of MEPAs, or how well those MEPAs are working towards their objectives, the fishing pressure, and the connectivity. And the main results we found here were time of protection was one of the most significant predictors, and these were more important for partial protection MEPAs, where you could see that MEPAs of those categories, they took about 15 years to see a real increase in biodiversity. The other one we could see is that fishing pressure haven't influenced the whole play by no-take MEPAs in protecting biodiversity, which is also a highlight. And connectivity was, again, one of the other important predictors, which are also more associated with partial protection MEPAs. That means MEPAs which are partially protected, they depend on time of protection and connectivity to see a more positive results. So we then, just to give a glance of how we compare ecological and management effectiveness, we could do this assessment and over all MEPAs along the coastline, and you see that we have some relation between ecological and management effectiveness, but this is not always true. For example, here you see just 2 types of assessments. In brown colors, the management effectiveness, and green colors, the ecological effectiveness. And we see the main scores. These scores comes from 0 to 1, where 1 means very effective, and 0 means no effective, ineffective, or no effectiveness at all. So we see here 2 patterns. One is that the ecological effectiveness of no-take MEPAs are much higher than the way they are assessed for the management effectiveness. And then we see a completely reverse pattern for the other 2 categories, extractive reserves and multiple use MEPAs, where actually we see a higher management effectiveness values if we compare with the ecological effectiveness ones. So why then is it so important to identify priorities for the protection? As we see here, all the MEPAs are not perfect. Some are more effective, others are not working so well. So again, Brazil has one of the large economic exclusive zones. That means there are a lot of habitats still lacking protection, and the existing conservation plans to manage and to improve marine conservation in Brazil, usually they focus on specific groups or specific areas, like coral reefs or mangrove areas. So it's really important to have a more comprehensive conservation plan to look what's missing in terms of protection for the future. And again, of course, we, based on my previous slides, we see we have a variable conservation effectiveness. That means existing MEPAs, some of them working very well, others might be not so effective, means then we need to identify priorities for further protection and increase those levels. So for that, we performed this study collecting data, and was a collaboration with several universities along Brazil, along the coast, from the north to the south. So we performed this special prioritization and combining 3 main steps. The first one is conservation planning, which basically integrates different levels or layers of information, and I'm going to detail a little bit more. The second one is the cumulative impact assessment, which is also a very well-recognized framework for identify areas for further protection. So when you combine all these two pieces together, we perform this special prioritization, which ends up with this result for the map on the right. We're going to present a little bit now. So we perform this, we collect data from all this type of data, so benthic habitats, pelagic habitats, threatened species, and ecological connectivity. And also, we also collect we also collect data for the human users in the ocean, such as commercial fishing, land-based threats, ocean-based threats, and also global threats such as sea surface temperature rise and ocean acidification. So I'm gonna just present a little bit how the steps involved in this process. Here you can see for two parts of the ocean in Brazil, how the benthic map was done. So basically we divide the Brazil coastline along the ecoregions following Spalding, which is a well-recognized map for marine ecoregions on the world. Then we divide all these ecoregions in the benthic depths, which are also recognized to structure biodiversity along following a depth gradient. Then we divide all, it is a hierarchical process. Within each baton, we divide into two major types of substrate, hard and soft. And then we have this fourth level, which actually habitat types. And then we have these specific types within each type. For example, coral reef was further subdivided into geomorphological types. Seagrasses, just one example, was also divided following the type of species associated with these habitats. So we end up then with these 150 benthic maps, which are using the prioritization. One important step I want to mention here is the formulation of targets, because most of conservation planning exercise, they use uniform targets. They don't really vary what is required to each species or habitat to be protected. And here we combine these three pieces of information in order to make our conservation plan more impactful for biodiversity. And those criteria were the distribution area, the vulnerability of each habitat and threatened species to the threats which matter for each habitat or species, and the sensitivity and the level of tolerance of each habitat to each threat. I know it's a little bit, I'm gonna move a little bit quicker now. I know it's towards the end of the talk. So the last, I also just want to mention, it's also very important to design and incorporate connectivity at the seascape level when performing conservation planning. And for this study, we did we measure connectivity for reef-associated species following this study, which is based on oceanographic modeling. So we apply this formulae to identify what is the characteristic length of connectivity between reefs for 4 model species. And then we could combine, for example, reefs and here you can see the ecological networks for 4 different species, and you can see each circle here represents one reef area, and you can see how this vary across species, showing that we have more well-connected species, but also species where are poorly connected, and this all needs to go into the conservation planning procedure. So when you finalize all these layers and we put all this together to come up with a map of irreplaceability, which means how important different areas are for achieving those conservation goals. And those are the results coming from blue to the red. We're showing towards the red, it's the most important areas for achieving those targets. As you can see here, all ecoregions more or less have important areas for protection, maybe with a few exceptions, mostly towards the oceanic ecoregions where we have already a higher level of protection surrounding those oceanic islands I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. So the last step here was to do the cumulative impact assessment, which basically incorporates information about 24 threats associated with different human uses in the ocean. And we have this map here in Brazil using additive score approach. This is just one example where we use several different types of layers, such as fishing intensity, thermal stress, coastal development, sedimentation, ocean mining, but also oil exploration. So when you combine all these 24 layers and assess how these layers overlay the habitat and species location, we end up with this map showing again, we have a very large variation of cumulative impact, mostly with a big red patches towards the south, where of course, as you can easily see, the ocean is heavily impacted. So then just to finalize, we use those information, this map and the irreplaceability map I showed a few slides before, we combine those to identify priorities, and then the top priorities, which are the areas showing red in the center map. So basically we divide all these areas according to the top decile. So we use the top decile of the cumulative impact assessment. We also gather the cells within the top decile for the irreplaceability. And then we see that some of those planning units actually fell within both top deciles, and those are the top priority ones, which are shown in the map in the center, as I say. So basically they are more in the eastern and the southwestern and closer to the coast. But if you check the priorities, where are the orange patches here, you see they are much more well distributed along the Brazilian coast, even incorporates seamounts and seamount chains towards oceanic areas, environments. So in summary, I want to just present here this framework for using integrated approaches to track effective progress on marine conservation and identify priorities when chasing policy targets. I combine here then conservation planning and cumulative impact assessment and propose those as one of them where we can actually incorporate more robust data and to inform science and the chase of policy targets. They might not be pragmatic, but framing multiple conservation objectives in planning when planning MPA is necessary. As you see here, not all MPAs are effective, and we really think that design and doing better MPA planning can improve the implementation of MPAs over time. So achieving just area targets might fail to promote conservation outcomes, as we show here. Not all MPAs are working perfectly, and then we need to think about better ways of designing this for future MPAs. I just want to acknowledge all the collaborators have worked with me for these papers I just presented today, and I'm also want to acknowledge to be thankful again for UFPR for the invitation.
Thank you, Rafael.
I don't know if I pass a little bit the time, sorry.
No, it's okay. I think you are on time. Very nice talk, also a very different perspective. And we have one question for you here from Rosana Rocha. She's asking, Rafael, are there evaluations of effectiveness of no-take reserves towards general biodiversity, including no commercial species like invertebrates?
She asked me if this assessment incorporates no commercial species, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, this meta-analysis is based on data which have been already collected, and most of this data are actually from fish species, but we also could found maybe, I don't remember exactly the number of observations for benthic species like invertebrates. which are not commercially used, and we also see a positive change for benthic species not associated with fisheries. So yes, we could see a positive change for MPAs, no-take ones on species which are not exploited.
Right. Okay. So I have one general question for you.
Yeah.
So you have a different perspective from the other speakers because you are from an environmental agency, and you have shown many results related to partnerships with research centers and universities. Yes. And how do you think we can, as a research centers, we can assess these environmental agencies, and how does it arise, our partnership with universities and graduate students?
So, sorry, your question?
Institutional standpoint, not your personal trajectory, but how do you think from an institutional standpoint, how research centers can help environmental agencies there?
Right. I think by several ways. I think by performing applied research, for example, or try to, well, I know all type of research has a value, of course, but some research, for example, in Brazil, I see it's really, we don't really have like an established network of researchers performing more applied research as maybe other countries. For example, I have my experience in Australia, where I see we have a more consolidated network of researchers just doing this analysis. I show you, and of course, I see those researches are made maybe they are exploring a way more. There are so many other things to assess, and of course, in Brazil, we still don't have a consolidated network of researchers looking at this more, like consistently over time. So I think that by doing more applied research, by also being very, keep your eyes open for the decision-making process and try to participate in all this type of involvements. For example, all these biodiversity conservation agencies, they perform lots of tasks associated with biodiversity conservation, of course, such as the red list process, the MEPA planning process, and we all benefit from interacting with researchers. In many times, this is not possible for some reasons. So a more integrated our work is with other researchers, better science, better information, better input data we might have to advance, right, our tools and inform better the decision-making process. I think those are the two main ways. There are others, but a little bit more polemic. So.
Okay. Actually, I'm actually working with a network of researchers on some pollination service.
Yeah, you mentioned.
It works. You are right.
Yeah.
We have one question from Camila Domit. She asked how the triad science, governance, and society would be strengthened by the ocean decade, the UN ocean decade.
Well, yeah, I feel like I think it is all this, again, all these international goals, which are much more, let's say, decided at the global level, they end up putting a little bit of pressure on the national policies to make a change or to incorporate more science into the decision into the decision-making process, sorry, or like the one we saw, the case study I show where we saw this large increase in marine protection in 2018 was also related to one of those international goals. So basically, all this international framework has some impact in the international level at increasing, and all these agreements, as more we can refine the interpretation of those agreements, is actually better for us to take better decisions, right? So the problem I see, and I think it's a critical gap, is that, for example, not long a time ago, I was assessing the report for the CBG, checking the conservation assessment of the marine biodiversity in Brazil. And I see that this is pretty much open to the interpretation of different scientists or practitioners. So, and this can cause a bit of confusion, how you actually apply those agreements which are made at the international level. So it's really important for us to actually try to kind of translate those high-level goals, which usually are more broad, into more quantifiable and objective and more data-driven approaches for us to actually do to put us in the right path and actually make an impact for conservation, right? And don't waste the opportunity when you just basically chase policy targets.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So we now have our third panelist, Professor Joly. Thank you, Professor Carlos, to be here with us.
Well, thank you for the invitation to be part of this roundtable. And I'm in the difficult position of trying to discuss a little bit in terms of governance. We've heard before Peter focusing on the Sustainable Development Goal 15, and then Rafael on Sustainable Development Goal 14. This is life on Earth and life underwater. But when it comes to governance, what are the major problems that we can see? How do you transform high quality research like the ones that have been presented by Peter and Rafael into policies, either public policies or private policies? And this is a major problem that is not restricted to Brazil or to Latin America. It is a worldwide problem. The interface between science and policy is an interface that we still have to train people to be able to do it. There are a lot of good initiatives that are doing that, like the Association of AAAS in the US that is having a program on science diplomacy for young people. The Inter-American Global Change Institute, INI, that has a program on training young people in the interface between policy and science. But let me take two examples, two short stories to see how different approaches can come to different conclusions, and some of them are good lessons for us, and I think would suit well the discussion we are going to have afterwards. In '99, when FAPESP launched the Biota program, the Biota of a PASP program. The program established a series of rules of how sampling should be done, established a standard sampling protocol that at that time required the coordinates, the geographic coordinates, something that is obvious today, but at that time, a GPS was quite an expensive equipment and we were not very used to use it. We had to have training courses on how to use it to get proper data from it. And for several years, we produced very high quality information about different taxa all over the state. We managed also to do all the mapping of the remnants of native vegetation using high resolution maps. So we, after 8 years of program, we were quite disappointed that the information that we were producing, that was freely available on the internet, you could just enter and build up a map on the fly. You could choose the layers you wanted. You could choose the species distribution or whatever information you wanted. And this was not being used by policymakers. And we were very naive at the beginning. We thought, oh, well, we have all this very good information available. People are going to use this information to make their decision. But the guy that is looking after a conservation unit in the extreme of the state, like a Pontal do Paranapanema, he doesn't have the time to go through all the data and to get the information that is important from that data. The language is not adequate for them to use. So we had a meeting, actually quite a series of meetings, on discussing this with the State Secretary of Environment. And then we put together a group and we decided to produce or to translate that information into useful information for policymakers. It was a long exercise. It took us 2 years to complete it, to clean our list of species. And you all know how difficult it is with taxonomy and getting all the right names and the names that are accepted and so on. And finally, we've got a very good list. We had the maps and we managed to cross the information on size of fragment, distance of a fragment from another one, what was the matrix of that fragment, if it was pervasive or not for mammals, for example, or for birds, and crossing the information on the species that were present, if they were endangered species, if they were invasive species, if they were threatened somehow, and the information on landscape metrics. We managed to establish a ranking of the importance of those fragments for conservation. That was something that was already very useful for the State Secretary. You had very solid information behind all those fragments that could be preserved or not. But we also concluded that in the state of São Paulo, conservation was not enough. We, mainly for the Cerrado areas, we had lost the capacity to keep the population of large mammals, for example, because we fragmented so much the areas of Cerrado. We had 8,000 small fragments of Cerrado scattered all over the state that lost the capacity. So we needed to reconnect those fragments and increase their capacity of conservation. So we prepared not only a map of the highly priority areas for conservation, but also the highly priority areas for restoration, how to recognize, how to do where this was more important, and this, after presenting and publishing and having this data available, the data started to be used for policymakers. Almost all conservation units, protected areas that were established, either terrestrial and marine, that were established afterwards, were based on the results of the information that was on those maps. The same time, with the Secretary of Agriculture, the planning and the zoning of sugarcane plantation was made in accord with those areas that we consider most important for restoration in inland. So we managed, by putting together the information in a single data bank, on getting a standard of information, and then sitting with the policymakers and understanding what were their needs to transform that information, we managed to make that useful for policymakers. The next step, we were sort of challenged by the necessity of learning more about how this terrestrial ecosystem function. How is this biogeochemical cycles going? Mainly, how is the cycle of carbon going? Are these areas of forest uptaking carbon from the atmosphere, or they are releasing because of the decomposition of the carbon that has been stored underground? So we established a series of other experiments for 10 years to produce good capacity for modeling and establishing scenarios. So now we know what's happening with the Atlantic forest. We know what happens when you transform an area of semideciduous forest into an area of eucalyptus or into an area of sugarcane. How much of the on the water balance you change that, and the importance of keeping those remnants in terms of their ecosystem services they were providing. So now we've got to a stage that in February we are starting a project that took almost a year and a half to be approved by FAPESP. That is a new initiative. It's a new sub-program within the biota, but we called it biota synthesis. And this is different because it was co-produced. So before writing the project, we sat down with the State Secretary of Environment, State Secretary of Agriculture, State Secretary of Health, and discussed it together with them. 5 major problems, 5 major questions that they needed to have data, they needed information to make decisions. Decisions like how would be the program for getting recognized the areas that are established by the new forest code, by the vegetation, natural vegetation law. So how this can be done? Do we have areas enough to compensate for owners that don't have area enough for the legal reserve? What about the permanent protected areas? What are the deficits? Where it's more important to start recovering those? So now we are producing a guide of information. We already have some of that information, and we are sitting, discussing now the start of this project that should be in February is led by Jean-Paul Metzger, and is focusing on questions of pollination. That is for our host, Isabella. So we pollination and how much the value of pollination, and this new systems that you have of renting bees for pollination. Most of those systems are using Apis mellifera. We think they should use native bees. But more than that, even if you are using native bees, what happens when we start moving populations from one side to the other, even around the state? Some can be from other states. So we need a lot of information behind that if this is going to be used for improving or establishing policies. But this is something that we've learned, the co-production. And it's difficult, it's not an easy, as I said, it took us more than a year to manage to get it as a project. And even so, it took a long time to go through all the systems in FAPESP. And then it came the nightmare of bureaucracy to get all the signatures we needed from the different state secretaries to get that paper going. So now that the paperwork is over, we're going to establish in February. On the other extreme, at the international level, in 2012, finally we have the IPBES was established. You remember the IPBES was to serve to the Convention of Biological Diversity the same role as the IPCC to the Convention of Climate Change. But IPCC already existed in 1988, and when the convention was signed in 1992, it was obvious that they were the guys that were going to do the scientific reports to serve as guides for the decisions of the convention. This didn't happen for biodiversity. There was a body that was established within the convention. It didn't work. In the Rio Plus 10 in Johannesburg, so 10 years later, we realized that it was not working. It was decided that we needed another element, another organization, and it took another 10 years for IPBES to be established. So we were 20 years behind IPCC. So we started quite fast producing assessments that are different from the kind of information that we have before, because you have information that come from various sources. And in case of IPBES, it can come from traditional knowledge, it can come from science, it can come from all the different stakeholders, and it's used for establishing this assessment. As Rafael said, those are overarching, they are very large, they are broad in terms of the guidance they give. But what is one of the results that came from IPBES is that it incentivized the establishment of national platforms that will work those issues, use the same framework, intellectual framework of IPBES, and applied it at the national level. We did that with the Brazilian platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services. And we produced one first Brazilian assessment on biodiversity and ecosystem service. And then we produced 4 others that were focused on different aspects, from one for pollination, one for restoration, one for water, and one for the integration between climate and biodiversity. It's now recognized as the way of going forward. We have to discuss this in the national level together. There's no solution for those crises if they are not discussed together. So we produced all this material, but we had the bad luck of having them ready at the starting of the darkest period in government in Brazil. In terms of environment, it couldn't be darker. Everything that we produce seems to be just in shelves, but it's not like that. All those things are being used to discuss with the technicians, the people that are on the ministries, that are on the state secretaries, that are employed there, that have their career there, that don't depend on the politician, this is on the top, that want to use that information to get things ready when the moment is a bit better, or in the case of state level, to get those things being improved. And one of the things that is moving, again, we've tried that before, but now it seems to be moving, is the question of having a national policy for pollination and pollinators. That is something that we need, is recognize the importance in terms of the benefit for agriculture, the amount of money that is linked to the production or the increase in production that you have when pollinators are present in relation to areas where you don't have any pollination. So this broadest level that we have, the world is now coming to a situation that is near our needs. And this is the major need that we feel, like I said in the beginning, is this translation, is sitting together and understanding the problems or the questions that the policymaker has and how we can help with science. It's not deviating our science. We, at the Biota program, we make sure that the researcher was doing what he was trained to do and what he's very good on doing. The only thing we wanted was to have some standards so that we could use that information in other ways than only training people and publishing in high quality journals. That is a need that obviously should be go on, and it must be incentive. But you can also have the same effort and having another use for that information. So this is something that I would like to bring for the discussion, and I'll finish my presentation now for us to have more time to discuss, is how we can improve these, how we can make it easier to have these connections between policy and science. Thank you very much for the invitation, Isabella.
Thank you, Carlos. Very nice talk also, and really integrate the others. What is nice to see is everybody agrees, from Peter, and Rafael and you, that we need strong database, high quality of information. We need trained people, and we need even this capacity building that was done by IPBS and then President Platform. And I agree that we need this co-production work to really move forward. And I think we can do it in small groups. Like, for example, we have one group of researchers working in small groups in co-production with people working in agriculture. But you have an example, nice example from Biodiversity. It's really a research program for large standards. So this is really moving forward, I think.
I must say we are afraid when it starts, but we hope it will produce good results. This is a new way of doing it.
Yeah. It's one way to reach our goal to policy, to be close to policymakers. And we have one question here. We have one question from Marco Randi. Hi, Joly. It's a great pleasure to see you again, almost 35 years after my graduation, having you with my professor. Oh, my question is, don't you think we need to build a more robust coalition among research scientists for trying to occupy legislative positions instead of only keep counseling policymakers? Or at least try to be in the policymakers' teams, being close assessors?
Yeah, that is something that is very for us as the researchers, the thing to fight our way to get a position in Parliament. We wouldn't be in numbers sufficient to change things. Obviously, it makes an enormous difference when you have a member of Parliament that's really focused on biodiversity conservation, climate change, and environmental issues. We saw that in 1987-88 for the Constitution, when he had Fabio Feldman as a member of Parliament, and all the years that he was in Parliament afterwards. We managed to get the law on the Atlantic forest. We got the law on the national system of conservation units. So it makes an enormous difference. We don't have anyone at the moment that exactly like that. We have a lot of members of parliament that are helping us, that are established a parliamentary front, but they are dealing with many issues as parliamentary life requires. But I think that yes, we should have more scientists on the advisory group near the members of parliament. In the beginning of the last state government in São Paulo, the governor proposed that in each secretary, you should have a scientist that would be in charge of advising the state secretary on issues that needed science to be solved. Then for many reasons, most of them political reasons that were sort of, the excuse was that there was no money for that. We are too expensive. So there was no money for that. But anyway, I think that this is something that we have in Great Britain. They have a senior scientist. You have senior scientists for health. You have it also in the United States. We see Fauci coming forward and explaining a lot of things and reassuring decisions that the government is taking. But we don't have this tradition here. I think this would help quite a lot if you had somebody that's there, not that one person will solve, but that person is the contact between the problem that's being faced and the community of research. It obviously got his groups and can discuss and can bring fresh ideas into discussion. So I think that would be the way to be as advisors, not be members of parliament or being the state secretary of some of these issues. That's my it's a personal point of view, obviously.
Yes. Andre Padial asked a similar question for everybody, all speakers. Do you think society should push towards the active participation of scientists and scientific societies in government decisions and company policies? I think this goes, as you said, and perhaps Rafael and Peter may want to make a...
And another point that I would like to raise, Isabella, is not only in parliament and in government, it's also on the private sector that we need a better connection with science, because private enterprise have a lot of power. They decide a lot of things, how they are implementing those things. So I need, that's also something that we need to work better.
Some comments from Rafael or Peter on that?
Sorry, can you just repeat again the question? Because
yeah, the question is, do you think society should push towards the active participation of scientists and scientific society in governmental decisions and company policies?
Peter, if you want to go first.
Yeah, if I understood it right, it's about whether society should advance the inclusion of science in decision making by government. Is that was the question? Is that right?
Yes, or even enterprise companies.
Yeah, I mean, I think Carlos has done a fantastic job covering most of this. I think that obviously we want science to be part of any aspect of society. I think it's, we're talking about finding repeatable ways to use knowledge to improve life, right? So that's the basis of science. I think we all agree on this. The challenge is just that we speak languages or we communicate about information in a way that's not accessible to the public. And I think we have made huge progress as our communities of scientists in communicating better, but there's still a long way to go. And I often, I wonder how we do a better job reaching out to the general public, because that in the end is our audience. This, or should be our audience, because they should be driving what decision makers make. I can speak a little bit of the progress that I feel we're making in the US. I don't know enough about this in Brazil, but I think our professional societies can play an enormous role in doing this by developing outreach and connections. They can essentially also be our lobbying arm with government bodies. So the American Society, the Ecological Society of America, the Conservation Biology Society, they all have offices on the Hill here in Washington, D.C., and they continuously brief Congress and Congress members that want to hear about it on this stuff. And I think those things help. I think these organizations also really work to develop outreach for schools and to communities. I think a good way to reach the public is through education of children, because often they bring the knowledge home, and that's when recycling and biodiversity and species become a discussion point at home because the children ask, then this works. But I think there's a long way to go, and I would love to hear others for ideas on how we better do this.
Sorry for my phone. Thank you. We have one more question from Camila. She says, thank you, Dr. Rafael, and Dr. Carlos for your speech. We are talking about strengthening science and governance, but how can science be used as a tool by today's society to guide better governance, action, and decisions?
Yeah, it's not an easy challenge, but I think that as I said, we can do a lot as advisors, and as Peter said, the scientific society can also have an important role here. We don't have so strong individual societies. I think we have the Brazilian Society for the Progress of Science, that is equivalent of the AAAS, Peter, is the one that's there in Brasilia. They have people there in Parliament. They are following what's happening, and they are coming with questions and asking us for help in some of the subjects that are being discussed. I think, as far as I know, it's the only scientific society in Brazil that does this. Then you have a lot of NGOs that also have people present there and sort of serve as a way of interface between them. But as I said, if you take the younger generation, it's much easier to work with. We've been spending quite a lot of money in biota and producing material that can be used by schools or out of schools, and having expositions, interactive expositions, things that will bring kids that are in a urban environment almost all the time, that to have some contact with nature, and you don't have to tell them. They do this by themselves. They love nature by instinct. We just have to keep that and give them the right and good information for them to use. As I said, bring them back home and discussing this with other colleagues and so on. I wonder what Rafael has of experience.
Yeah, well,
also a lot of experience on producing material for younger generations.
Yeah, I want to complement a little bit on that. Maybe I think Camila's question is a bit more, can also be understood in a little bit more general. Let's say, I also think strength institutions is also one key role in Brazil, and I think it's very necessary. So our institutions are still a little bit, let's say, weak or maybe fragile in some aspects. So like encouraging people to do training and invest more in knowledge, invest more in human resources. I think Brazil did very great for several years, but of course, we are also facing this COVID-19 pandemic crisis, and we are all facing shortage in financial resources. But I think doing this sort of investment, it's a long-term investment and can also help in this good decision-making process, incorporating more science into the decisions.
Rafael, we have a question for you from Rosana Rocha. How do you see the connection of and I have always the trouble with this word, environmental managers and policymakers? Do you actually contact people in parliament to discuss necessary laws? If so, are them receptive?
Sorry, it's between practitioners? Did you say decision? Can you?
Yes. From your position as an analyst and policy, and if you actively contact people in parliament to discuss laws, and if you do, those people are receptive, if you see this connection.
If I see a disconnection.
If you see,
Isabella, do you want me to talk?
Okay. Yes.
So I'm here. Sometimes it's easier to see the person. So the idea, we are talking a lot about scientists talking with the parliament and making the necessary laws and everything like this, and the decision makers. And I was wondering about you in the position of a manager in ICMBio or in Burma or other kinds of ONGs. So as managers, do you also have this movement to go to the parliament and discuss necessary laws? So you might, when you're doing your fiscalization or research or anything like that, you might feel the necessity of new laws that you don't have, that we would like to have this to be able to work. This is the idea.
Okay, so we might have this chance to provide evidence and provide information to the parliament. This already happened, particularly for example, I can remember one case was the potential recategorization of the biological reserve of Alfredo. We might know it's closer to you all from Paraná. But this is very, unfortunately, this type of contact, it's very punctual. So we don't really, we actually, in the parliament here in Brazil, we can track the process. You can subscribe to the website as a person, as an individual, to track the process of if you're interested in one particular subject. But we can actually, the interaction, it's very limited. So it's very only in one specific time to maybe provide evidence, but we cannot keep it unless you actually, you are like in a position, let's say, working the cabinet of the president of one of those institutions, or maybe you are assigned as a director, which I'm pretty sure they might talk about these things more regularly than us. But if you belong to the technical body of those institutions, of course, this happens only on specific times to answer specific questions. And that's it.
Thank you.
We have another question from Camila. What is the importance of technology innovation to bring science and governance close and to achieve sustainable development. And thanks you for the previous reply.
Was it to me again, or it's someone else?
It's
for everyone.
Everyone.
Okay.
Now I can read again. Important technology and innovation to bring science and governance close and to achieve sustainable development. So the link between sustainable development.
Well, I think that Peter showed in his talk all the use of new technologies to trace endangered species or to trace a group of particular species that is of interest of a group of researchers. So I think those we have to incorporate all the tools that we have. As Peter said also that they have these trap cameras, and trap cameras produce a huge amount of data. To deal with that, we need the help of e-science, of people that are working with big data. It's not, they can analyze those things and can find patterns that we probably wouldn't see. I think this is becoming more common, and I think that we need really interdisciplinary groups working together to solve solutions. Well, when we did the Brazilian assessment on biodiversity and ecosystem services, for instance, we overlooked the particularities of the areas, the marine and coastal areas. So now we are developing, Rafael and Rosanna know this, that we are developing a specific assessment of those areas. And this will need quite different approaches, and we'll need different tools to get those information. So I think that's particular. Perhaps Peter that can say a little bit about the new ways from LiDAR to tracking cameras.
Yeah, I think that, if I had to say something, it's not even that so much technology. I think there are some fundamental things that are changing in the field of science that need to be accelerated. And in my mind, they mostly have to do with how we acknowledge and reward the collection of data in science. There's too many barriers for people to share their data and their science and to work collaboratively. And that's partially, I think, because traditionally the our system of recognition is based on individual scholarship and accomplishments. When species in the world cannot be saved by individuals, they can only be saved by communities. And somehow we haven't managed to figure this out enough to really make much faster advances. And it puts us at a disadvantage with politicians and other places because they want to see that we have proof, and we can't show this proof because it's fragmented across organizations and individuals. So that would be any technology and tool that brings us forward with sharing data and compiling data and working together, I think would deserve an advance. And the other thing I would say is to really push governments and agencies to make any data, data should be in the public domain. I think Brazil actually is doing a great job. I mean, you have this, you have a cadastre of land use online. We don't have that in the US. So, but those are the kinds of things that would really accelerate our ability to talk about sustainability. My 2 cents.
And the other phase of the same point, we also need to understand and to incorporate much better traditional and indigenous knowledge, because there's a lot of information there. There's really a lot. And how to share that and at the same time respect the rights of the owners of that information. But I think this is changing. I think it's becoming more frequent that you can use this knowledge. It's enormous.
Yeah, I was going to mention as well, incorporates more social science and indigenous knowledge, as you say, more closer to biological sciences. It also is a huge gap for the conservation science.
I think we're moving to that. I think only when you have this social science incorporated to conservation science, really conservation science, then we'll be able to move forward. So do we have any more questions from our audience? Perhaps not. So if we don't have any more questions, we have like 5 minutes available. If we don't have any questions, so we are closing our session, and I really thank you for being with us today and share so many ideas and so many interesting perspectives. So I'm very happy to end this panel, and it was and to thank you.
Well, thank you for managing all this and leading us through it. So, and it's a pleasure.
For organizing it. Thank you, Isabella. It was a great panel.
Thank you.
Thank you as well. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Peter, Carlos.
Yeah, it's nice to meet you.
And congratulations for the Professor Emeritus that Carlos Joly has become today.
Oh,
Congratulations. Congratulations. Thank you so much for all of you. It was great. It was a great panel. Thank you so much.
You.
Bye-bye.